Hello, Memoir Nation. I am Brooke Warner. I am here doing an all things memoir on my own without Grant today because I wanted to give a little bit more context about what is going on with this book, The Tell, a memoir by Amy Griffin. And the reason I think it matters is because this is probably the biggest memoir scandal to hit us in a long time. I think it's going to turn out to be the biggest memoir scandal of all times, frankly, just because of the players involved, what exactly is being alleged, and also because at the center of this story is sexual abuse. The fabrication of sexual abuse is what it's looking like. And I think it's hard to imagine something much more disturbing than pretending that you were sexually abused so that you could write a memoir and become famous for being a victim of sexual abuse. So I want to give a little bit of context, and then I want to talk about why this matters to memoir and to memoirists and why it matters to me. I am a publisher, and I do want to say that because I've been working with sexual abuse stories for over 20 years. So I'm pretty familiar with this genre, the genre of sexual abuse at large. Sometimes it's very central to the story, sometimes it's sort of a periphery to the story. But at the end of the day, it's always a big deal. It's a big deal for the victim, better described as a survivor. You know, survivors are the ones who are writing these memoirs. And what happened with Amy Griffin is that The Tell was hugely successful. You know, it is a bestseller. It's sold over 100,000 copies. It was an Oprah pick. She was endorsed by Reese Witherspoon and Gwenyth Paltrow. She's hugely connected. The book is about sexual abuse and basically pretty gnarly depictions of what happened to her as a young girl growing up in Amarillo, Texas, and being abused by her teacher. When The Tell came out, I have to say that, like a lot of people, there was something that struck me as a little bit odd about it. I did not read it, and normally it would be something that I would gravitate toward, but I think it was her privilege and what I understood to be like this very well-off New York socialite publishing this book. And not to say that I didn't believe her at the time. I just was not exactly sure why this particular book was getting so much attention, you know, other than this celebritization of memoir, which is something I'm actually fairly critical of. And so I think I distance myself from it for that very reason. Well, now fast forward, you know, to September of last year, the New York Times did some reporting on this book and started to cast doubt on its truth. We actually did all things memoir, Grant and I, about that. The scandal at the time in September, well, the scandal has gotten much, much, much worse, as the dude says in The Big Lebowski.
New shit has come to light.
The new shit that has come to light is the fact that a Jane Doe has filed a lawsuit. She filed the lawsuit on March 4th. I think I found out about it on March 6th. Today is March 13th. So many days have passed since the lawsuit was filed, and lots of people are talking about it. But basically, Jane Doe alleges that Amy Griffin, the author of The Tell, stole her story. So what that would imply is that Amy Griffin is not a survivor of sexual abuse, and that she wrote this memoir about being a survivor and surviving really, like I said, next level abuse and rape from this teacher. And possibly, probably none of it happened. There's so many questions, you know, and I don't want to go into like endless speculation of, is Amy Griffin actually an abuse survivor? What the hell happened with the teacher who she actually accused? My question on that front is like, is that a false allegation? What is going to happen to him? Because if it is a complete false allegation, then that is hugely damaging to him, but obviously hugely damaging to whoever Jane Doe is. And that is what she is alleging, right? Which is that this is emotional distress, that Amy stole her story. Interesting to this story also is the fact that the ghostwriter, Sam Lansky, and the publisher, the Dial Press, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, are also in the lawsuit. And I don't exactly know which charges belong to whom, but it's invasion of privacy, emotional distress, fraud. There are 7 different charges. I'll put my Substack into the link so that you can read more if you're interested in the ins and outs of the legalities. But the reason that I wanted to come on and talk a little bit about this is because memoirists get very freaked out when stuff like this happens for good reason, because memoirists already are worried about not being believed. I want to say memoirists of survivor memoirs. Let me please qualify that, because when you're writing about your abuse, you have often lived with that story, that truth for a really, really long time, and probably have been confronted with the fact that people maybe don't believe you. Oftentimes, with abuse that happens in early years, childhood, teenage years, families are complicit. Sometimes they are friends of the family. Yes, sometimes they're teachers and coaches, but in those contexts, usually these are at-risk girls who end up having these kinds of perpetrators come after them. Sometimes maybe the parents are not in a position to be very available. These perpetrators groom girls oftentimes because their parents are not, as around. Maybe they display certain kinds of qualities that perpetrators know that they can take advantage of. Now, I'm not saying anything about Amy Griffin because I don't know what kind of kid she was as a young person, but what we do know is that she came from a very prominent family and that she had a lot of money, which would suggest that she would not be the kind of kid who would be an automatic target. Whereas Jane Doe was in the foster care system and seems to very much have had an upbringing that would be the kind of upbringing that would make her a target of a perpetrator. So I'm just saying that that stuff is in the mix. Now, what I want to say about abuse memoirs in general is that I have worked on countless of them. I have worked with so many survivors, I could not even count them. They are often really scared to bring their stories forward. They have often not been believed, or they've been living with a secret, a deep secret for their entire lives. It shapes everything about who they are in the world and their lived experience. It is a source of deep shame and fear. And the act of writing these memoirs is an act of courage and bravery and healing. It allows them to reclaim their narratives. It's such important work. And I think that's why I'm so incensed that someone could possibly state or claim that they had written a survivor memoir, which seems to me to only one conclusion, which was for the purpose of fame, for the purpose of being seen in the public for having a story, which maybe suggests that Amy Griffin did not have anything else going on in her life that would be interesting enough to merit a memoir. And so she chose to write about this topic, which is not something that she actually experienced. Now, to give her the benefit of the doubt, maybe she has experienced sexual abuse, right? I mean, many countless women have. Maybe she has something in her past that allowed her to springboard off of this much more gruesome experience that her friend and classmate had. But nevertheless, whatever it is that might in fact be in her past, and I can only speculate, that this story belongs to someone else is really quite unforgivable. I want to address memoirists who are writing about abuse, just because it's often something that never ends up getting published because people are afraid to put the truth out into the world. They're afraid of how they're going to look. I want to say that in addition to working with abuse survivors on their memoirs, my ex-wife is also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And so it's very close to me. I experienced the fallout of her memory recovery, which was not through MDMA, which is what Amy Griffin used as a vehicle to recover her memories or to talk about her recovered memories, which automatically lent some skepticism to some of it in the first place and makes it very difficult to prove. But my ex had recovered memories and it was very real. I mean, it was something that later in life she began to unpeel the onion, as they say. And I think it's actually not that uncommon. It does not have to be drug supplemented. So this stuff that we're talking about, it's very personal. And what Amy Griffin is doing here, if it turns out that the story that she wrote doesn't belong to her, is stealing someone else's life story, stealing the worst thing that ever happened to them, and then somehow, bizarrely, glamorizing that and making it something for which she is going to be celebrated. And so the whole thing is so twisted. I don't think that most survivors write memoirs to be celebrated. Most survivors write memoirs because they are trying to claim their story, reclaim their narrative, something that was stolen from them in the first place, to kind of make it right for themselves and to make their world make sense again. And then also another huge reason that survivors write these stories is because they want to advocate for others. They want to help other women who may have experienced similar things, but I think also kind of preventatively in the hopes of reaching young readers. I don't want to say that they can prevent abuse, of course, but the earlier the identification, of like, this is a problem, this is a trauma, this is PTSD, oftentimes it's complex PTSD. The earlier that you can identify that, the better your healing journey is going to be. And so for a lot of survivors, that is a big motivation. I also do want to say, yeah, like people have PTSD and complex PTSD as a result of these things. I don't think that Amy Griffin has touched much upon that. She's just been on these interviews like, oh my gosh, it's so important to tell my story. And I noted in my Substack piece that her bio says she has everything to lose by telling this story. I think that's such interesting phraseology. She has everything to lose by telling this story, almost like there's the tell. That's what I said at the end of my piece. Like, there's the real tell. I can't even begin to express how upsetting this story is for memoirists, for survivors, for people who care about narrative. It should be upsetting for ghostwriters. It's upsetting for the publishing community at large. I will close by saying a word about book publishing because there's been a lot of talk about how publishers don't fact check. I will say that's true. I've been in the publishing industry for 25 years. We don't fact check memoirs. Maybe this will lead to a reckoning on that front, but some people have said, oh, well, journalists fact check, and so why should publishers not fact check memoirs? It's very different. When you're a journalist and you are uncovering a story, when you are investigating a story, you need to get your facts right because you are writing about another person or something that happened or a scandal or whatever. So these reporters that went down to Amarillo, Texas to report on Amy Griffin, they lived in Texas for 3 months. They investigated. They needed to get all of their facts right. When you are a memoirist, you are showing up to say, I wrote this story. This is my story. This is how I remember it. We do, in fact, have disclaimers in memoirs that say, these are the events as I recall them through my lens. And I think that a disclaimer or an author note is very appropriate for memoir. But the notion that I am going to go and verify one of my memoirist's abuse stories by calling up the perpetrator or going to their town and somehow diving into their high school or middle school archives to figure out who did they go to school with and were there other survivors. I'm literally struggling to understand how that is my role as a publisher or an editor. Not to say that the publishing industry doesn't have a problem here. I mean, I agree that we do. But our problem, unfortunately, is liars. Our problem, unfortunately, is this celebritization of book publishing and like in general, people becoming famous for some of the worst things that ever happened to them, which then does incentivize people to lie. The other problem is just the ways in which you can clearly buy access if you have enough money to Oprah and Gwyneth Paltrow and Reese Witherspoon. The reason that Amy Griffin is connected to these people is because of money, because she gives their companies money and she sits on their boards. And so there's a lot going on here in the world of big publishing and how much we pay people to publish their books. And so then these kind of bizarre incentives that happen to like glorify yourself and your own story when you have the means and access to do that. So I have more to say on where the publishing industry needs to go from here based on this. But because I don't work with celebrity memoirists, because I work with real women who are oftentimes interested, like I said, in telling their stories for reasons of advocacy and for reasons of reclaiming their story, I have not run into this and I don't think I will. I think at the intersection of all of these problems is like where fame meets attention seeking, meets excessive amounts of money, meets celebrity culture. And so there is much to unpack here, but I always want to leave on a message to memoirists, especially to you who are writing survivor memoirs. Hang in there. Don't let this story get you down. Yes, be angry or disappointed, get a refund, contribute to this conversation. But the genre of memoir actually needs defending from things like this. And that is why I'm doing this message today. I've often felt compelled to be in a position of defending memoir for lots of reasons. And unfortunately, this is one of the most egregious that I've ever come across. So I will be eagerly awaiting any kind of message from Amy Griffin, her publisher, Sam Lansky, the ghostwriter, Oprah, Gwenyth, Reese, any of you who have supported this book. I think it's time that you come out and say something about it. So we're all standing by waiting. See you later.